Yeah, this is pretty loosey goosey. I figure we just shoot the shit and see where we go.
Okay.
Sound good?
Yep.
You want to start by? Let's start by. Can you introduce yourself?
Phoenix Nicholson. I've been writing professionally since 2014, and been keeping notes and journals and stuff since I was able to write.
What what do you write?
Mostly fiction. Um, a lot of personal experiences, but if I say that it's fact, most people would say, "Oh no, we can't believe this."
Why not?
A lot of it is paranormal stuff and things about my family that people we grew up with never knew about, stuff behind closed doors. It all started with ancestral archaeology, looking into the past, questions that nobody in the family could answer. So started looking for the answers on my own.
What kind of questions?
Like basically uh, what relationships were real and what were just made up stories.
Well, what? Well, let's unpack that because I think that's actually really interesting. And when when did this start specifically?
When I was really young, we were told about certain relatives that had experiences that just didn't seem realistic. So it was not until I was in my 30s or 40s that I started going to these locations and trying to find out firsthand what was real and what was made up. And I think it was my younger sister and I first started looking at some of these things, some of these locations, and things that happened there. And on the way back home, she said, you should write something about this. So it started as a short story, and then a book, and then a trilogy, and then it just went on from there.
What were some of the stories that you'd heard growing up that and like what's an example of one of the unbelievable stories and how it translated into what you found while researching?
Well, one of them was our so-called cousin Bertie, which was not really a cousin. It was a my mother's grandmother's aunt or some really removed relation like that. She lived in Whitestone, Virginia, which I'd never been to, never heard of it before. But the original story was about how her husband died, and he was supposedly um, not very. He did not control his drinking very well. Um, and one night she went downstairs to open the door and let him in, and there was a particularly nasty fight that went on between the two. Uh, she stormed upstairs, he stormed outside, and she heard one of the horses um, acting up. So she looks outside and sees him attacked by the horse. Now, the way she tells it, um, she was alive for quite a few years before I started writing, but I remember her saying that she saw him walking the stairway to heaven. In other words, she saw him die. But the way she put it, I was like, that stuck with me. And then I started thinking about what made her say those things and what made her phrase things the way she did. So I started visiting that area and looking at her house and looking at the people that lived around her. And they all had a different way of expressing things, and they all had their own individual stories that were sort of hard to believe. But as you dig into it, you find out there's a lot of facts behind it.
Was she just so is her describing an ascent on the stairway to heaven just her way of saying I watched him die?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's just the way that she said it. And in my little head, when I was like 6 or 7 years old, I was imagining, that she'd actually seen him walk this physical stairway. But as I thought about it and thought about the way different people in the older generation express themselves. It just stuck with me.
I think that happens with a lot of people though, where like you hear these stories growing up, and the way a child will interpret what's being told to them is so far from reality. Like I remember my dad telling me about these people who would drive around our hometown in a big pink Cadillac without a hood, and it didn't have a gas tank, so they put gas in a milk jug, and it somehow managed to jerry rig it to the engine. And they drove around in this until the milk jug melted and blew up the car. And the way he describes it, it was like an all summer affair, and that the end of the summer, it just all. But no, it was an afternoon.
Yeah.
That milk jug didn't even last a day. And when you find out it's just an afternoon, and it wasn't even a beautiful pink Cadillac, it was an old rusty Ford that just you wouldn't look at it twice, and it's just something about stories that really it paints a picture of history for children. And actually that movie Big Fish, I don't know if you saw Big Fish, but it's very much about that.
Yeah. A lot of the other stories I heard were like, interaction between, I had 5 siblings and my mom and dad in one little 2-bedroom house with 1 bathroom, which 4 girls in 1 bathroom. You can imagine the fights that came out of that. But we were told different things from mother and father. There's different perspectives on what is expected of you and what life expects of you. And then I found out as I grew up, the people in the neighborhood thought my parents were like the pillars of the community. And I was like, you don't know the real truth. There's a lot more going on behind the scenes. But I think that plus like the story you were telling, it fascinates me, the different stories and how people interpret things. And I write for myself because I looked at different authors and their advice on how to write and their tips on successful writing. And I believe it was Kurt Vonnegut that said, just write for yourself. So it's hard for me to categorize what I write because I like I said, I would consider it fiction, but most of the people that I grew up with read it and go, I remember this. So,
Do you ever get people reading your writings of these and coming back and being like, well, we could correct this, or this, or maybe it was like this?
no, actually, most of the people that I've talked to have said, I remember that. Or you put in something I don't remember and it brought back this other memory. And that's how the first book turned out to be as many as it is now. Basically, because when I put the first one out, I started letting my relatives read it and say, what do you think of this? And all of the questions they came up with was, well, you forgot this part, or there's something else to that. Doesn't this make you think of that? And it just spawns more journeys and more research. And a lot of it is just stuff like the short stories that I've written in the anthologies are basically when I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would just get a notebook and I'd write down what my dream was or what my thoughts were. And I think it was about 2013 that my son came into my room and he wrote on a whiteboard, he wrote, you can do this shit, so do the shit, I believe in you. And I kept that on my wall in my study for the last 8 years as an inspiration, like you can do it. And there's somebody, even if it's just your kid that believes in you, why not? So I just took all those notes that I've written for the last couple of decades and just put them all together, and with my adult censorship made it to what it is today.
At this point, do you feel like because other people find value in it, you said that you're reminding them of things that they'd forgotten or didn't know, is it changed your approach in any kind of way, knowing that it's not for you anymore as much?
No, I never thought about that.
Well, I can tell you straight up, like when I went into this, it was pure ego. I'm like, I got these stories to tell, me. But then my sister was like, she'd read a novel I'd made called Objects and Giants. And I describe this novel as being a huge failure from an audience standpoint because nobody will pick it up and read it because the opening, the line is really like just graphic and lots of curses and Barnes and Noble would never feature it. But she said that it was the best thing I'd written at that time, and that got her reading more of my work. And a lot of my work's very memoir based.
Right.
But I would write things that she'd forgotten about or have no recollection of. And it got to a point where she started calling me the giver. I don't know if you ever read The Giver,
Yeah.
where he just has everyone's stories. And so like I'll come at her with another essay where I call my nonfiction short stories essays to differentiate them from my fiction. So I'll give her an essay about like an incident where she overboiled pasta and our mother just went bitch cakes on her for no reason. I'm like, oh, it's an 80-cent box of pasta, Mom. Come on. And she has no recollection of that. And so she appreciates that I give her these little stories that I guess the trauma of our upbringing, she just blocked most of the childhood, whereas I put it away in a vault to write about it later.
Yeah. I think the most, besides getting good reviews on Amazon, I think the thing that makes me happiest the most about writing is I had the rare opportunity to have my mother actually talk to me about something I had written before I even put it out in print. I had showed her what I was going to do. And she said, I don't remember this, but here's something you could correct. And she said, are you ever going to put this out, for sale? And I said, no, it's just for you and me. And she said, okay, well, since nobody else is going to read this, I'll tell you this. And I just happened to have a little pocket cassette recorder in my pocket, and I recorded everything she said. And it took me, I think it was like 3 or 4 years after she died that I actually dug up the cassette tape and played it back and started transcribing it. And so, I don't think I can actually write this, but it's funny when you talk about writing things that make your relatives or parents open up to you. I don't have any relatives, older relatives, that are still alive. And I'm not sure if you can see it. My mother's portrait is up there on the wall. That's her when she was graduating high school. I had sort of borrowed without permission her high school photograph that was in her top drawer. And somehow one of us, probably me, had torn it in half. And when I was stationed in Germany, I went to this artist and I said, can you reproduce this on canvas? And it was black and white because that was back in, I guess, the 30s. And he said, I could do that. And he reproduced it and he did it in color and put it on canvas. And that Christmas, I said, hey, Mama, I borrowed this from your dresser drawer. And then I gave her the portrait and said, Merry Christmas. And that was back in the 70s. And she kept that till the day she died. No matter where she lived, she kept that with her. So when she passed away, I had called my sister and I said, no matter what you get out of her house, I want that portrait. And that has followed me and my sister for the last, God knows how many years. But she had stories about when it was in her house. There were times that she felt that mom was there and conversing with her. So I wrote down some things she said that mom told her. And then when I moved to, well, 2 years ago, I moved to Alabama. And I said, can I have it back now? She said, sure. And I said, ever since I've been here in Alabama, if I didn't have it up on the wall, like no matter where I put it, there were different sounds and events that occurred. Once I put it on the wall, those things stopped. So there is some correlation to that, besides the cats. The cats don't cause all the problems. But I do believe that there are things in this world that we can't see and that we can't explain. And to the people who are affected by it and who experience it, you can't prove to them otherwise. And the converse is true. People that don't believe will never believe. But I'm thoroughly convinced that it's all true. That when people die, their energy is still here in some way.
Well, what is?
I'm getting off on a tangent, aren't I?
Yeah, it's fine. It's low stakes, man. Low stakes. Well, let's talk about some of the paranormal interests.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that somebody says? What's the spookiest thing you've ever experienced? What would your answer be?
Spookiest besides my dad being mad at me? Probably, I think when I lived in Maryland, before I gave the portrait to my sister, there would be knocks on the door, on my study door, doorbell ringing, and I'm looking out my study door downstairs to the front door. There's no kids out there at all. We had no electronic security system at the time. And I couldn't figure out why the doorbell was ringing. I know the cats can't activate the doorbell. Different knocks and things. I know the funniest thing that was sort of spooky at the time, I was about 3 o'clock in the morning, out of a sound sleep. I wake up and I hear somebody in the living room talking about Margaret Thatcher. I think, what the heck is this? Somehow the Google Nest home device had activated and was starting to discuss Margaret Thatcher. And I said, okay, Google, shut up. And she said, okay, but did you know? And she kept talking. And I unplugged it and I said, what would happen if I unplugged this and it kept talking?
Yeah, that's not the first time I've heard about those devices. Like after somebody dies, those devices will randomly activate and play music that person who died liked. So like favorite songs and things like that. Yeah, it's pretty spooky. I
was curious though, something I was going to ask you, have you heard of any authors that are hesitant to write or to read before they write something in fear of being accused of plagiarism or having somebody else's story leak into theirs?
Yeah, that happens mostly though with students. So like I experienced that a lot with undergraduate people and some of the MFA people who were in their 20s who maybe they were writing an epic science fiction thing and they're like, I can't read Dune until I do this just to make sure it doesn't affect me, right, or something like that. But I'm just like, well, wouldn't it make sense to read it? I don't know. My contention is people should just read so that they know what's out there.
Right.
If somebody's really that afraid of plagiarizing, I think that's a whole other psychological problem because plagiarism is really, I think it's two things. One, it can either be an intention, which is nefarious, or it could just be a lack of citation, which is innocent. So if you don't properly cite, you're plagiarizing, but it's not as big of a deal as somebody who's like stealing a page of text from Bukowski and being like, I wrote this,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I find that's more of a young thing that people grow out of.
Yeah. No, as you were talking, I don't know why, something in my head started to click that when I used to be a police officer and I was working at the Pentagon right around, it was right around 2000, um, when that incident happened where that airplane tried to park inside the building. Um, there was a lot of theories the very day that that happened about how it was not real, it didn't happen, etc. And I remember walking through the damaged part of the building, and I wasn't present when it happened. I had just gotten off work when it happened. And I know people that were standing in the parking lot and saw the plane coming down and described seeing the people in the windows of the plane that crashed and seeing their faces. And it affected them so bad they quit their job on the spot. And I would like to find those people and find out whether or not that was one of their scariest moments. And then turning on the news that night and hearing about people saying, oh, it didn't happen. You know, I would like to interview somebody like that actually saw it.
Oh, well, I got thoughts on the people who deny it, who just refuse to accept, what happened.
Yeah.
I think that some stuff is just so traumatic for people that it's not accessible to them, and then they gravitate towards the more ridiculous just to, I don't know, to be okay with it. But on the other hand, too, I've found that people don't really understand how government works. So, like, if we're talking about 9/11 conspiracy theories, which I think we are, right?
Yeah.
So in my early 20s, I was very much into that kind of stuff. But of course, I grew up on an island off the coast of Maine. I had no idea how the world worked outside of this small fishing community.
Yeah.
It was only after I moved to New York, I finally started attending dinners with these elected officials. I finally started meeting people who worked in intelligence. And, one of my first movies I made in New York, we went down to D.C. for a day. This was in Bush's second term.
Right.
And I just walked right into the Rayburn office building. I walked right into the chamber of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I filmed a scene of our actor playing a fake fictional senator ordering a hit on our main characters using the phone in the Senate Armed Services Committee. And it's just like, people don't get it. Like, government isn't this tightened thing. It's a lot of public servants going to work day after day after day and occasionally dropping the ball. And when they drop the ball, that's when shit hits the fan.
Oh yeah.
And
They're living in a fishbowl.
think about it as the DMV, but where the people at the DMV are responsible for the national security. If you look at it that way, then suddenly, like, conspiracy is just impossible to an alarming extent because one, people can't keep their fucking mouths shut.
Yeah.
I would have dinners with like elected people who were on these committees where they were required to keep secret a lot of the stuff they talk about. I know people who work in intelligence who have contracts with the DOD, they can't shut the fuck up. And so, like, I feel like if something as big as 9/11 was truly a conspiracy, we would not only know about it, but we would have evidence up the ass, and it's just not accessible to me. But one of the strongest things that you've said on here so far is that image of people seeing people's faces in the windows of the planes. I've never heard that image before. I've never even considered that image before. But I guess at the rate it came in, at the angle it came in, it makes sense that that would be something somebody saw.
Well, when it came in, it hit a street light pole. So if you ever see video, I'm not sure if anybody broadcasted it. It's probably on YouTube somewhere. But the airplane actually clipped one of the lampposts before it hit the building. And a lot of people don't know. One of the first things they told us when we first went into orientation for the job at the Pentagon, they said, this is what the history of the building, how it was made, et cetera. It was built very quickly for such a big building. The number 5 is very important because there's 5 rings, 5 floors above, and who knows how many below ground. But the walls, the exterior walls, are 1 foot thick concrete. And back, I believe it was in the 80s, a helicopter hit the side of the building by accident. I don't know if the pilot fell asleep or whatever, but where it hit on the edge of the building, the people that are in the office within feet of that crash never knew it happened. That's how thick the building is. And that's why, this huge aircraft could hit the building and have a tiny little hole. But if you see the inside of the building, it's very obvious what happened.
Well, that's the other thing too, is a lot of the people I've found that tout these conspiracy theories have never been to DC or New York. So they don't know how big these buildings really were.
Well, the other thing is about, like you said, about secrets and conspiracies and people keeping their mouth shut, which I said a lot more than I expected to. But a lot of things that they point to are the different time stamped videos. Like this guard booth had this time and this guard booth had that time. If you've ever worked in a government office building, like I think the Pentagon might be the biggest, they have thousands and thousands of clocks, and they're not centrally wired together. So you might walk from one office to the next, and the clock might be 1 or 2 minutes difference. You go to the outer ridges of the building or the outside where the booths were, there might be 2 hours difference.
Yeah. Well, that because it predates sort of everything being connected to a sort of GPS or however cell phones are now coordinating time. Yeah. This was before that. And I don't think a lot of people really get that either. One of the interesting books I read about 9/11 actually came, and I've been trying to get this guy on the podcast for a while now, but this guy Frank Mara wrote a book about working the Sifters site in Staten Island. So basically, they brought all the rubble from the World Trade Center to sift, and they brought it to Staten Island because out here in Staten Island, nobody cares. so. But he talks about some interesting spooky stuff. I think you'd really be interested in is he talks about how they would just pile all these broken vehicles onto one another, like New York City taxi cabs that were crushed, fire trucks that were crushed, and at night people working the night shift would see these whiffs of kind of black spirit like wisps, kind of seeming like they're searching through the cars,
right?
Like they're looking for something, and then they would just vanish. It's very spooky. And then there was this is the craziest story from this book. And I'm only telling it to you because we were on the 9/11 subject, but going in and out of the Sifter site in Staten Island, there would always be this black woman in a 1950s style Red Cross uniform with a platter of sandwiches. And everybody going in and out saw them, but whenever they tried to get a good look, she would vanish. Whenever they tried to get a picture, she wouldn't be there. But everybody who worked the site says that woman with sandwiches was there. And at one point, somebody told Frank that they think she might have been a spirit guide trying to guide confused souls or something. If you believe in this stuff, because with an event like that, it's probably so traumatic that if energy's left behind, like you say, certainly there would be a confusion, like what the fuck just happened, you know? And I don't know. I love that idea. It's so. I don't. I don't know why anybody would make something like that up, right? Like, it's so laser specific. A 1950s black Red Cross woman with a platter of sandwiches.
The kind of stories I really like to gravitate towards are those that are before the internet, before mass communications, where somebody from one side of the country to the other says basically the same thing. They've never met, they've never talked on the internet or the phone. That's the kind that makes you wonder, how did they get the same story if they had no internet, no communication, etc. Nowadays, you can just Google anything and come up with stuff.
Do you have a story like that?
Probably. Oh my gosh. There's so many that I have written and so many that I'm thinking of writing. And every time I talk to somebody, I get new ideas for things. And I have to ask them, can I use that story or can I use your name? Several conversations I've had it on Facebook Messenger with people where I've said, I'm going to use this. What kind of credit do you want? And a lot of them will say, I don't want credit. I'm not taking responsibility for this.
Well, I have an interesting story that I think you'll find intriguing.
Okay.
You know, my mother has had over the course of her life precognitive dreams.
Right.
And most of them concerned me for some reason. She had 3 kids, but I'm the middle child and I'm the one they're mostly focused on. One of the more interesting ones was when I was in film school in Vancouver, British Columbia. I was there for a year. And I had this one night when I was kind of stuck in the middle of nowhere. We were doing this film shoot at someone's house, and I didn't know the layout of British Columbia. And I also didn't have a driver's license, so I was dependent on other people for transportation. And everybody just decided to go do their own thing, and I was left in the middle of nowhere. I'm like, oh, how the hell am I going to get back to the city at 1 a.m.? And I finally get back there. Like, somebody remembered me and came to get me. But I finally get home. I go to sleep. I wake up at about 9 a.m. to an email. And back then it was an answering machine, like an old-fashioned answering machine.
Yeah.
An answering machine message from my mom. And she's like, just give me a call, blah, blah, blah. So I call her back, and she tells me that she had a nightmare the night before, that I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, and that I was concerned that I wasn't going to be able to find my way home. And I'm like, well, that's accurate. You were there. And I tell you, I've got stuff like this with her again and again and again. She once saw me drowning when these bullies wouldn't let me out of the water. And it's always at the same exact time that it's happening. So like with the thing with the bullies, I grew up on an island off the coast of Maine. So we would jump off the pier into the wake of the passenger ferry, and then the wake would push us out. Dangerous, but fun. And so these bullies who were summer people from New Hampshire, very spoiled from a wealthy family, probably had like 6 homes. One of them was in my hometown just for the summer months. They decided that Eric wasn't going to be left out of the water. And I swam under the pier, very dangerous, and I would swim through the pylons to get to shore so they couldn't see me. And by the time I got up on the rocks, my dad was waiting there in his truck. And I just walked over the truck, and I'm like, I got to get my stuff, but these bullies, they won't let me. And so he drove down to the pier, and he grilled all of them. He's like, he's got asthma, you assholes. How dare you? Like he was mad cool in that moment. And then years later, it turned out my mother was washing dishes, and she saw me drowning at their hands. Oh. And she said, Richard, your son is drowning. Go get him. And so he drove down, and that's why he was there when I emerged.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. After I moved to New York in 2003, I actually requested my mother send me a letter detailing all of her premonitions and dreams. And she did. She sent me like a 2-page, just kind of handwritten One, two, three, four, and I still have it.
Nice. I really believe that if you want to compare human beings to sort of like radio antennas, there's signals out there, whether they're real or just other people's thoughts or if it's energy. But I really feel like we're all like antennas, and it just depends on what frequency you're tuned into, whether you hear it or you don't. Because there's a book that somebody sent me called oh shoot, what was it? Into the Light. A good friend of mine from like 40 years ago just sent it as a gift. And excuse me, I'm gonna go get it. So I
Yeah,
don't.
sure. Go ahead.
It is The Light Between Us by Laura Lynn Jackson. And all I've gotten to is the introduction so far. And the way this lady writes and the experience that she puts in the introduction, it was like, I want to meet this lady because she's like right up my alley. And she sort of compares, in her own words, the same thing where she was seeing things, getting messages. And she said, this is not me. I'm not a psychic. I'm not a fortune teller or clairvoyant, anything like this. And she said, I was getting these messages. She said, I'm on my way to the speaking engagement, totally unrelated. And this was going on. And I was like, this is the kind of thing that has been happening to me, my family, going back generations. And I used to think, no, they're very creative storytellers. They're very imaginative. And as I get older, I realize most of it's believable to me. I mean, I've got friends that say it's a bunch of BS, but that's why I call it fiction.
Yeah, I safely declare most things fiction, even though they're
Yeah.
really not.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the horror novel I'm doing now is definitely fiction, but for the most part, I typically write nonfiction and declare it fiction.
Now, when you say horror, are you talking about like Clive Barker, the kind that's just very graphic, just for the sake of being gruesome?
Um, the main character does horrible things to women.
Okay.
That level of horror. It's not an atmospheric by any measure.
Yeah.
There is an alien presence, but they're more comedically anti-human.
Right.
So it's really it's an odd story, and it's an odd way of writing this subject matter, but it's kind of about aliens using misogyny to destroy humanity. And so
Oh,
they kind of recruit this guy to run their abduction program. And it's whenever he's doing his thing, it's fucking horrific. And it's supposed to be, obviously. But everything outside of it is utterly ridiculous, whiny, and bitchy. And and just like, how does this guy how has this guy managed to live to adulthood with his inability to function without the intervention of aliens? Like, it's a really weird book, and I don't even know if it 100% belongs on a horror shelf, but it's the only way I can mentally prep people for the level of devastation that he wreaks.
so how did you come up with the idea for that? I mean, I'm not saying where do all your ideas come from, but what
So,
made you think of that?
sure. Thanks for asking, actually, because I was trying to figure out where to put this information. So, there are several seeds for this novel. The first seed was the 2016 election cycle,
Yeah.
and how a lot of females voted for Trump, which I can understand why certain people will vote for him. I come from a small town where a lot of politicians just don't do right by people. But I didn't understand the female mentality. Like, to me, that only made sense in a dystopia. So I sort of designed the first part of that, the whole idea of him given this power over women, but the main character is given this power by another woman. So that's all rooted in this sort of mystification of how the hell can a woman vote for Trump? Because I live in New York, bro. I knew what he was in terms of his philandering and the way he looked at women and the way he saw females. I don't care where people stand politically, but when somebody's like that towards another gender, just as a blanket hatred towards them and an objectification towards them, I don't understand how any of them can vote for him. And so only in a dystopia did that make sense to me. And so the plot that I came up with was this guy has complete control over females, and he's given that power by a witch, another woman who hates females. And I think that is the most apt way I can describe how that felt to me in 2016. Now, that is, of course, a very controversial plot. That is a tough one to write, and that's taken me years to get it down just right so people can kind of get where I'm coming from with it. And so...
As you're writing this, though, do you already have a basic framework, or you know where it's going, or does the story carry you?
I had a framework for his journey in that regard. I didn't have a framework for where everything else would pop in. So as it developed, I sort of brought in other aspects. So one of the things I decided to do was make him a failed artist. And the reason I make him a failed artist is because all the most horrible people in history were failed artists. Hitler was a failed artist. So it made sense to make him a failed artist and to have that be intertwined in his narrative, because it's a first person present tense stream of consciousness narrative. It's literally putting readers into his brain, which is going to turn a lot of people off. They do not want to be in his brain. And that's the whole point. And so, yeah, it's so as it goes on, I'm kind of bringing in not just my experiences as a freelance creative, usually just the worst of the worst stuff. Most of my experiences have been pretty good, but I'm like, oh, what's some bad shit that could affect somebody who's really damaged? Right. And then I'll build onto that. And so I'd say seed number 2 was sort of working as a freelancer with questionable clients. And then there's a third seed, and that's, of course, the whole alien involvement. And that came very, very late. I actually put the novel down for a long time because I just didn't know where to take it until I started reading the works of John Mack and Bud Hopkins. Do you know who they are?
No, I haven't heard of them.
These are the guys who introduced the alien abduction phenomenon to the general public from an academic standpoint. So they were interviewing people. They were doing legitimate academic research. I mean, John Mack was a professor at Harvard University, and they actually tried to fire him for looking into alien abduction, and they couldn't because his approach was so sound and on point, and he ended up getting killed. He had a weird circumstances to his death. He was in London and he got killed, and that's the only conspiracy theory where I'm like, yeah, a lot of weird things just don't add up, like right. This guy who, they tried to fire him for doing this, and then he just ends up getting killed in London for no reason. But I'm not going to go into that. That's not what the podcast is. But yeah, I just became obsessed with it. And then reading about what people have been going through since the moment we split the atoms, people have been experiencing this phenomenon. Right. So I'm like, I'm going to roll that in because I think that that's really interesting. And that makes a lot of sense for maybe where I can take this character. And so it's evolved to a point where this is book one of what will be several. He's This has become what was it was originally a standalone thing, but now it's become the introduction of a villain of a much larger story.
So in that way, the pen is actually telling you where to go.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Have you ever started writing something and in the middle of it said, well, this one looked good on camera?
Would or wouldn't?
In other words, do you let how something would look on camera dictate what you write?
No, no. I mean, some stories that I think would make good films just end up being better in writing. Like my book, Objects and Giants, I first wrote it as a screenplay. And then when the production failed, I'm like, well, if I'm not producing it as a film, how might it feel as just a work of literature? So I started writing from the perspective of the main character, and it worked way better. It was destined, and it changed my approach in creative writing. It changed my voice because it was my first person present tense stream of consciousness narrative, which is now I declare that my style because it gets me into the mode of the character. But then there are some where I just can't write them as novels. They have to be either a series or a film.
Yeah.
And it really just depends on what it is. But
Well, the one that you were describing before that's now going to be a series, it seems like there's all these other influences coming in that are sort of molding what it's going to become.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, I'm very influenced by surprise, the need to be surprised. So I have this rough idea how these books are going to go, but I don't 100% know how they'll connect yet.
Yeah.
Like I know the next book's so if this first book introduces the villain, and he's very much a villain, then the next book has to introduce the guy who's going to beat him. Because
Right.
I am a sucker for good endings. So we're gonna have a character like that. And I'm I'm developing it in a physical notebook. I handwrite a lot of my notes.
Yeah.
And but here's the thing is with the villain that I'm writing now, at first we think he's good until
Right.
he's given power, at which point we realize, oh, the moment this guy got power, he just quickly started doing really bad things.
Right. Right.
Whereas the good guy is going to be introduced as a guy you'll hate at first,
Huh.
but will ultimately be the guy that saves humanity in the big picture. And so that's all I know. I'm not 100% convinced what his profession is.
Yeah.
I know his name will be Dale. That's about it. I know that he has his own issues.
But it's definitely not a Hallmark movie because everybody in Hallmark is perfect.
I can't write that stuff. I don't. I just it's too inaccessible to me.
My wife is, she will watch Hallmark and just zone out. I just, there's some TV shows and movies that within the first 5 minutes, I'm like, I can't deal with this.
Yeah. Well, with Hallmark and some of those Disney shows, like I get it after like a day of just nonstop bullshit. Maybe you had a tough commute. Maybe you had a tough day at work. Having a show where everybody's super nice to one another, like in Full House or Fuller House, or one of those shows, like oh, isn't it so nice that everybody on TV is so nice to one another and has it so together, and it can be relaxing, and I get that, but I don't have the ability to write that. I just have too much I want to do with what I already am writing.
Yeah. So do you have a lot of irons in the fire?
Yeah. Yeah. I have two graphic novels going on. I have this novel, which is wrapping up soon. I was planning to drop it in May, but it'll probably looks like late June that it'll be available. It's called Saratoga Landmine. And then, yeah, it's a cool title, right?
Yeah.
And then next in autumn, I'm dropping a poetry collection,
Oh,
which is it's more experimental verse. It's also short stories in verse form. There's some comic book stories, so I do like 1-page comic strips.
huh.
Yeah, and it's sort of a collection, and it's called Running Guns Across State Lines, which is my euphemism for like creating art that nobody wants but everyone needs.
Interesting.
Sort of like dangerous art. It's what's I'm trying to think of this phrase that people use all the time, like necessary evil. I hate that
Right.
term, but I think that's what certain types of art have to be.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, there's a lot. There's like screenplays. There's other half finished novels, and I mean, it's ridiculous. It's just like shelves and shelves of notebooks.
Jeez.
Yeah. But the ones that get finished are the ones where, like, if I can find that third seed, it's always in threes. There's something about the number 3, bro. So everything has, if it's finished, it probably has 3 separate seeds. So for seed with Saratoga Landmine, seed 1 was, of course, the election cycle. Seed 2 would be just like elaborating on freelance horror stories. That was fun. And then seed 3 is bringing in the what I call the others, because who knows what they are? Who knows what people are experiencing when they talk about alien abduction? So I'm just gonna be like, oh, they're the others. That's what I call them.
Now,
And
would you be this busy if it wasn't for the pandemic?
I would be this busy. I loved the. I mean, I'm not gonna say I love the pandemic, but I love the time the pandemic gave me. I was the most
Right.
productive I've ever been. I started the podcast during the pandemic. I don't
Oh,
honestly think I would have been able to had I well, I mean, prior to New York lockdown, my day job was running video direction on another show. So there was a financial podcast, and I directed all the video content for it. But then the guy moved to Miami because he didn't want the restrictions. And I'm like, well, I'm not moving to Florida. Sorry, bro. And so I stayed behind and I started my own show.
hmm.
Yeah. And it's been an interesting growth because I'm at the tail end of season 2. So the seasons are September through May.
Right.
And then I take summer off because I'm a beach bum. So season 1 in the fall of 2020, I guess. I guess that's when it was. Yeah, 2020. It was just me talking about how I'm staying productive during the pandemic. That's all I was doing. It was me and the microphone.
Yeah.
And then I would say, well, here's how I found clients prior to the pandemic. And then how I found some of my better paying clients. Just offering advice to people.
Right.
And then I'm like, well, I'm bored with this. So what else can I do? And I dug up, I used to interview creative people all the time for various film festivals and other outlets. So I'm like, well, I own a lot of that content. So I'm going to dig up a couple of my favorite ones and put those up and see how they do. And so they did well, like all these old interviews with filmmakers and whatnot. And so I'm like, well, maybe I'll just start interviewing people about their creative process.
Right.
And that's kind of how it evolved. And honestly, my intent was to interview more filmmakers,
Right.
but I can't get them because Hollywood insulates everybody, and with PR firms, agents, and managers, and so it's really hard to get filmmakers who are actually working. But writers are very accessible, and
Oh, yeah.
I actually one of my childhood heroes was an author named Avi. He wrote the greatest ghost story I've ever read. It's called Something Upstairs. It's spooky. It's very short. It's a time travel story where they go back to Revolutionary War era Rhode Island and with the ghost to figure out how he died. And so it's funny. When I reached out to Avi, I had to do it the way kids do it. So he has a PO box on his website. It's like, if your students want to send me any letters, just send it to this PO box. And so I sent him a letter to this in much the same way a child will send him
Right.
letters. And I was like, oh, I got a podcast and I grew up with your books. And so that's how I managed to get him on. And that kind of changed things because he's a big name in YA literature.
Right.
Yeah. It's been going since.
I think when the pandemic started, it was, I think around here, most people said, oh, it'll be over in a day or two. Yeah, right.
Wishful thinking. Well, you
Yeah.
know what? Nobody's been through one.
Yeah.
Like, it's been several generations since we've had a real pandemic.
Yeah.
And so
And I just felt like at the beginning of it, I was just hitting my stride and I had all these ideas and notebooks full of ideas. And then all of a sudden, the kid was home all the time. And then the wife was home all the time. I was like, I need a break, guys. I need to do some writing here. But yeah, they've now got her down to, it was teleworking. It started off 3 days a week. Now it's 2 days a week. And the new building, well, she works for the FBI. And they just built a new building in Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, in Huntsville. And they're supposed to be moving into the new building in June, but they're still fumigating the place and getting, the final details put in place. Meanwhile, it's either 2 days a week at home, 2 days a week at the office and 3 days home, or 1 day in the office. And without a schedule and not knowing what to expect day to day, the writing has sort of been put on a back burner. But I'm still jotting down notes in notebooks and on the notepad app on the phone. I did have a very interesting experience that was about 1.5 years ago. I relied heavily on the notepad app on the cell phone. So if I came up with a little phrase or an idea or something I thought was a good idea, I'd type it into the notepad. And I told my kid, I think he was about 17 at the time, I said, I'm an old man. I don't understand technology. How do I transfer all of this to paper? Now, I don't have the ability to send it from the notepad to the printer. Can I cut and paste it and put in another app? And he said, yeah, I'll do it. So he took the phone, he did a couple of things, and he said, oops, and then handed me back the phone. And I said, what does oops mean? And he said, well, I lost it. You'll be able to get it back. 2 years of notes on the app are gone. They're in cyberspace somewhere.
So
they cannot be.
Yeah, that sucks, man. I'm sorry about that.
So,
one of the ways I avoid that kind of shit is I just email it to myself.
Yeah, that's what I've started doing. Yeah.
Yeah. I think my email is mostly just notes to myself. It's how I do everything.
Yeah. But sometimes I'll sit there and think, well, I sort of have an idea a vague idea of some of the ideas I've written down. I try to bring them back and I try to, do stream of consciousness, just doodling and trying to come up. And it's gotten me nowhere so far. But I keep hoping the pandemic ends and the kid goes back to school and the wife goes back to work. And then it'll just be me and my cats. And they're my writing supervisors. So right now they're at the door. I don't know if you can hear them, but they're crying. Like, let us in, Daddy, let us in.
Yeah, I have that too. I have 8 of them here, and
I
I'm
don't know how you
surprised that
feed them.
that they're not here because usually they know when I'm recording and they'll make an appearance.
Well, you said you're in an apartment and you've got
Mm-hmm.
8.
Mm-hmm. In a 1 bedroom New York City size, so
Oh
it's
my God.
tiny, but it's okay,
You're trapped.
Yeah. Well, you saw that photo that I posted on Twitter of me riding in the hallway or in the
Yeah.
corridor in the stairwell. That's why. Sometimes you just need to break free.
So when we lived in Maryland, at one point we had 10, but we had a bigger house and there was plenty of room. But once we found out we were coming to Alabama, I was like, we can't afford this big of a house in Alabama. So we found homes for a couple of them. One of them died the night before we moved. And we moved down here and I think we had 4 when we moved down here. And we just last Christmas, um, we got 2 more against anybody's better judgment. But they're just, they'll sit in here and watch me type. And sometimes one of them will sit on my lap and just lick my face until I stop typing. But I love cats. I think they're amazing. Because they will sit there and watch you, and if you don't bother them, they're happy. But once they want something, they'll let you know they want something.
Yeah, we've been dealing with 2 sick cats this past month. Where I mean they're the older ones. It was always going to happen at some point.
Yeah,
But what they do is they show you that they're sick, and it's so amazing to me that like you know how sometimes cats will just puke for the sake of it.
yeah, oh
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, when there's something genuinely wrong, it's not just normal puking. They'll
yeah.
come up and they'll puke right next to my keyboard, and then they'll walk away. Oh, vet time. That's the reason I went to the vet this week. And this dude was so thankful that I responded by getting him medicated. He slept like literally on my head. He just
Yeah,
wrapped himself around my head on my pillow
yeah,
all night. It was wonderful. And they do stuff like that. That's how they communicate.
yeah,
And I had another cat who had a urinary tract infection. And so she would pee in areas where she knew that I would be.
right.
And wouldn't be much. It wouldn't destroy anything. It'd just be enough for me to notice. And as soon as I got her antibiotics, she stopped doing it.
Yeah,
They're smart, man. And I know the one I just talked about, she knows her fucking name. If you say kitty,
yeah.
she'll come running. And hold on, she's probably moving now because I just said it.
I know. I have to watch that. The electronic cat, the Google. If I'm talking to somebody, um, and I accidentally say the word Google, it'll activate.
That happens here with when my girlfriend's on conference calls with her job. There's somebody who has a name similar to Siri,
Oh my gosh.
or something like it's similar to Hey Siri. And I just activated my phone, by the way. So if you say that name, it thinks that you're saying Hey Siri.
Yeah.
It's really weird.
It's
But
funny when I grew up, there were no cell phones, there was no internet. Nobody even thought of personal computers. I never thought I would have a device that I could talk to. That without going to the library, you can just ask a question and it has the answer or several answers.
yeah, it's
To me, it's amazing the technology that we're dealing with. And I keep wanting to write something about that, but I haven't got the background in the information technology to actually pull it off yet.
yeah, I think about that a lot too. Like, because when I was a kid, for me, thinking about the future, it was always flying cars this and flying cars that, and when are we going to get our fucking flying cars? And but it didn't occur to me that we were entering what has now been known as the information age. But you can't really
Right.
predict these things, I guess.
Yeah.
We have the industrial age, and now we have the information age, and it does make me wonder what's next because I'm clearly not good at predicting anything.
Well, I think due to the pandemic, we are entering the lack of information age because we have raised, some of us have raised kids that would rather talk on the cell phone than go to college or have a job. Um, at present, I have a 20-year-old who is unemployed, does not drive, and does not go to school.
Well, I didn't get my license till I was 35.
Oh, wow. Well, being in
Yeah.
New York, yeah, I mean, everything's close by, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there were a lot of factors. Like in my hometown, there was no law. It was an island off the coast of Maine, so you just drove when you needed to.
Yeah.
And then when I moved to New York, it was just like the public transit here, for all its faults, is pretty efficient and effective, and it's 24/7. So I never needed to. And then I moved to Staten Island and I returned to my education late in life. So I got my BA and my MFA in my 30s. And so it was during that era that I just decided, you know what, I should just do this. We could go hiking more if I get my license because we like to go in the woods. And yeah, I powered through that. And I was the only adult. Everybody else was a teenager.
It just makes me wonder, though, with the way things are going now and how accessible so much information is. I wonder who's going to be powering or fixing these machines we rely on when nobody knows what's behind it. You know, like some of the kids growing up today and up into their 20s don't understand the mechanics or the electronics or anything behind these computers.
Well, the
All they
average
know is,
people aren't going to. I mean, everything's code now, right? So
yeah,
really the people who are going to be running all this stuff are coders. And I was reading an article recently on how Google vets people, and they're basically looking for people who not only know coding but know how to troubleshoot every area of pretty much anything, so that they can grow
yes.
into new jobs as new technology is developed.
Hmm.
So the average Joe's not going to be able to fix the refrigerator after a while, but that's just the way things go.
Yeah. Hmm.
I mean, I was never handy anyway. Like, I understand my phone a lot more than I do my car. Like,
Right.
I don't understand how my car works. I will not open the hood. Like, I'm like, that's the mechanic's job. I will, because when I had my first car, I'm now on my second car, but when I had my first car, I almost fucked it up for life. I almost crossed the wires on the battery wrong,
Oh,
and because I didn't know, and I didn't, thankfully, but this one I'm just like, you know what? Some people have it and some people don't, and I don't have it. But I could take apart my phone and I know exactly what all the different parts are. I know where the memory chip is. I know where it's storing all my data. So yeah, it's just specialties, and hopefully we'll have a. I'm an optimist that we're going to have a good education system to find out who can do what and put them in where they need to be. So I have a question about the FBI.
okay.
So they're opening up a new office down there. So would that regional sort of office specialize in certain types of crime?
Well, what they did was they took, my wife is a contracting officer. Basically, she goes to work to buy stuff like furniture, phones, helicopters, whatever they need. Um, and her contracting office was really located. I'm sure there's going to be other field agents and things there, but I think what they're doing is diversifying what was in the J. Edgar Hoover building, so that instead of having everybody in one building in DC, they're going to have specialty offices everywhere. So I believe what they're doing down here is it's going to be mostly the office workers, the secretarial pool, that kind of thing, the data people. I think DC is still going to be mainly, the G-men, the agents, and so forth. As far as I know, I think Quantico is still one of their main bases in Virginia for training. I don't know if there's any down here.
It kind of makes sense though that they would do that. I always thought that big institutions like that should diversify their locations. It helps boost the economies of other places, not just
Yeah.
DC.
Well, I know that the FBI building and the Pentagon building both, if never know who's listening, but
Oh, they're listening.
yeah, if they ever investigated and actually wanted to enforce codes, both the Pentagon and FBI buildings, the J. Edgar Hoover building would have been shut down years ago for fire violations, safety violations, you name it. Both buildings are falling apart because the Pentagon was built in less than 2 years, and it's massive. But you can't build something that quick and that big without cutting some corners. And it was built to code when it was built. That was quite a long time ago. And the same thing with J. Edgar Hoover building. But the one they're building down here in Alabama, we drove by and saw it the other day, and it looks like a Hollywood set. It's so beautiful on the outside. I'm not allowed to go into it yet, but it looks like an architectural dream the way it looks on the outside. From what I've been told, they're putting top-notch stuff inside. So someday I might be able to walk in as a guest. I don't know, but it's as far as I can tell, it's a very highly classified, secure base that very few people get to go on to. The Hoover building, I went in there a lot of times, and it was just a big office building. It was nothing special, except that the doors were huge. Like, instead of 6-foot doors, it looked to me like they were 8 feet or higher. These massive doors to each office building. I went off on a tangent again. I forgot what you initially asked.
No, you answered it. No, that's fine. I like hearing about that stuff.
Yeah.
It's all very not a part of my regular world.
Yeah, I take all this stuff for granted. Like when you were talking about going into the Rayburn house, there was a time many, many years ago during my first marriage that my wife was working as a temp worker in one of the offices, and I went and tried to find her. I never knew that place was that big, but every office I went into trying to find her, there was like a skeleton staff there, and your representative is busy on a fishing trip, a camping trip, etc. And then next week they're on their annual vacation, and it always amazed me that these people are making so much money. They're always on vacation. And when you look at the voting process online or on TV or on C-SPAN, place is empty. And it just makes me wonder.
Well, yeah, I was actually shocked that a lot of them don't even buy places in Washington, or they're like, they pool their rents and they all rent a place, be there for 1 or 2 nights a week, and then go back home to their home states. Like, I never knew it worked like that until I think some camera crew followed Schumer home or to his apartment, and he was rooming with a bunch of other Democrats. And it was just like, it was like a frat house that they were at 2 nights a week. And then they returned to New York or wherever, and Schumer returned to New York. I don't remember who he was rooming with, but yeah, it's very much a transient place for elected officials.
Yeah, it's changed a lot because I know when this country was first formed and they first came up with these representatives, it was not a paid job. And it was just you just transported yourself to that office, did your thing, and then went back home to your farms or whatever else you did.
Yeah, everybody actually worked, and they had their boots in the soil, so to speak,
Yeah.
in reality. Whereas now it's a profession, and I'm wondering if it should be.
Well, they're all kings and queens up there,
Yeah.
and some are kings and queens.
Yeah. You have an interesting story, man. I appreciate us figuring out how to do this because there's a lot I learned about you today.
Yeah.
Do you
I
have?
try not to talk too much because I've been told I don't have a zipper on my mouth.
But the thing is, with the podcast, that's what I want. I want you to ramble. So
Oh,
you
geez.
apologized a few times for it, but I'm like, that's what this show is.
Yeah, in the
I
back of my head,
seed the ramble, and then you
I
ramble.
keep thinking that somebody's going to see this and say, I heard what you said.
Yeah, you'll get that. I tell you, I filter out some nasty stuff on YouTube, but I always filter out the nasty comments.
Yeah.
Some people just don't know how to have a civil discourse. And that's
Yeah.
okay because I have power over my medium. But
I've always said that the foul language is the easy crutch of the mental dwarf.
I saw that on Twitter.
Yeah, because not only my son, but a lot of people I talk to cannot compose a sentence without a cuss word. It's like, read a dictionary.
Yeah. Well, I have my favorites, unfortunately. So we'll agree to disagree on that. But yeah, I remember you posting that on Twitter. I'm like, oh, he's not gonna like my books, but that's okay too.
There's a time and a place for everything.
Yeah.
But if you can't talk without saying a curse word every 3 words, something's wrong.
Well, some of the best comedy balances it nicely. Like if you
Right.
read a transcript of a stand up routine, you can tell which comedian is a good writer because they'll plug a fuck in at the perfect moment to emphasize the biggest
Right.
laugh. You know.
Yeah.
So anything for me, like to me, anything it just comes down to artistry. Like I don't expect a 16-year-old to be artistic about all of the f bombs they're dropping. You know.
Right. Well, I've been recently binge watching Dave Chappelle, and I watched some of the old Richard Pryor tapes, and I wish I'd been around and actually had the chance to see some of these people in person, because Dave Chappelle is one of the best at doing that, because he just says it and it flows. It's not like I'm saying this word because I'm proud of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
He has a point to make.
It's a device.
Yeah.
The yeah, and Richard Pryor too probably was the guy who's just like inspired a lot of acts to be a little more daring.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a headshot that you can send me for the video bumper?
Um. Yeah, I will probably get one and email it to you.
Cool. Yeah, you can take a couple of weeks. I
Yeah.
have a queue of episodes that are going to come first, and then
Oh.
I shoot everything ahead of time. So it'll be a while. But I'm thinking the season ends in May, so I'm thinking this will probably be episode 88, which is the second to last. At the end of every season, the last episode is usually just me.
Yeah.
And I just kind of let people know what to expect in the future, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Somebody told me a couple of nights ago, they said, make sure when you do the interview, plug all your books. Nope. That's a
No,
no.
well, what we'll do is we'll put links in the descriptions of
Yeah.
all your books, your website, Penwords,
Yeah.
and because it's not like we're promoting you as a writer, but it's not a commercial.
Yeah.
And that's actually a fight I had with somebody on the other guy's show before I started my podcast, because it's remarkable how many authors, like, you want to talk about the content of their books to a certain extent, depending
Right.
on the author, especially if it's a nonfiction author. And so we'll be like, well, what's advice that you give in your book about this, this, or this? And like, well, you got to read the book. Why would I give it away here? And I'm like, because we're promoting your book. Just tease a little bit, dude. And like,
Yeah.
it's just like there's certain things. So my advice, if you're writing self-help, it's okay to tease it. It's okay to talk about what's in the book. They'll buy the book if they find it useful. They're not going to buy the book if you don't tell them anything about it, though. That's a fact.
Right.
But with more creative writers and I guess I would call you a memoirist to a certain extent, right?
Okay.
We don't really need to delve too far into the stuff because you're writing you. So we just got to meet you and we got to hear you talk, and what you write about will come
Well, this is one of
through.
the best conversations I've had,
Yeah.
not only on the internet, but in person.
Yeah, and that's kind of like what I want to duplicate on the podcast
Yeah.
ultimately, is just those really great conversations over a cup of coffee. Because now I can get a better sense of what you are as a writer too, just by
Yeah.
getting to know you.
I watched a couple of your YouTube videos, and what struck me was the conversational aspect of it, that you're not asking questions like, where do you get this idea? Or any of the top 10 questions kind of thing. And most of the people are allowed to say basically whatever they want to say. And it's almost like I was a voyeur watching two people sit in a living room talking. And that's sort of the vibe I got from your videos.
Oh,
It was
thanks.
just
Yeah.
two people talking. It was really nice and relaxed.
I appreciate that, because that's what I was going for. It's my favorite type of podcast to listen to, so it makes
Yeah.
sense I would embrace that. And for the top 10 questions, the top 10 most boring questions, if you want a terrible interview, your first question should be, where do you get your ideas?
Yeah. Somebody asked that of Neil. Have you ever heard of Neil Gaiman?
Yeah.
He spent about, I guess, 4 or 5 minutes explaining why that's the worst question. And he was talking about how most writers will just either condemn you for it or talk down to you. And then he actually answered the question, but he was also, teaching the person, that's not a good question.
The best way to get the answer, and this is for any potential interviewers out there, the best way to get that answer is to not ask that question. You kind of did it earlier in a more eloquent way, where you wanted to know where something like that starts. Where do, because I'm writing truly a character that most people in this day and age would be afraid to write, given the zeitgeist. So if you can get them to talk about the different seeds of their stories,
Right.
that's a different approach. You'll get the answer you're looking for, but you'll get it in a more meaningful way, and that's the better way to go about it. But I think that's just most people will learn by experience. And I always said, like, this isn't the Today Show. Not only will I know who I'm talking to, but I won't ask you, where do you get your ideas?
Actually, an angel came down from heaven, handed me these ideas.
Well, isn't that the Frank Capra explanation? Like, Frank Capra said that he awoke one night and there was an angel in his room that told him he had to use cinema to reach people or something.
Something like that. Yeah.
So, but I'm gonna I'm going to wrap this up. I thought this was a good conversation. And
Yeah.
what I'll do,
surprised we were able to talk for so long.
it's how I typically go. I typically go about an hour.
Is the time limit for Zoom based on the host?
No. So you get 45 minutes maximum if you want more than like 2 people.
Oh, okay.
So if it's just us, we can just keep going. But I actually have errands to do, so I can't keep going. Otherwise, I would. But I would say let's keep in touch by email, and
Okay.
I'd say get a paragraph together about yourself. I'll put it in the description.
Okay.
Any links you want to share, I'll automatically share your website and your Amazon authors page. But if there's anything else, just let me know. And of course, the photo is really important too.
Okay. I appreciate it.
Cool.
It was good talking to you.
Likewise, we should do it again in a future season. Maybe if you have another book coming out,
Oh, yeah.
use it to plug it. And then
At least 2 or 3 right now that I'm working on.
oh, wonderful. Yeah. Me too.
Yeah.
So
We're staying busy.
yeah, let's do this again.
All right. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye.
All right.